So like, for instance, Mike Huckabee yesterday tweeted I believe he was like, I now identify as Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And he's playing somewhat to what this author is saying of like, this is
Right.
this radical subjectivity that people can sort of just say what they are and we're supposed to take them at face value, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Mike Huckabee's Chinese now. Let's take the train. Let's like take the train that he's now put us on.
Right.
Is Mike Huckabee going to be fundamentally treated differently because of his verbal identification? No. He will still be treated as a white man, right? So like, part of it is that trans folks are sort of taking a step to say, I identify this, and like knowing it's going to put them in more physical harm.
Right.
It's not going to put Mike Huckabee in physical harm to say this about himself.
I am John Chen, and welcome back to another episode here on the John Chen Out to the World podcast. I am joined by the wonderful and exuberant Alex Lange, now Dr. Lange to all of us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. The check is in the mail for exuberant.
Hey, I knew you from Michigan State University while you were still in student administration, and you were always very high energy, pumping people up, and so gracious and accepting of everyone that you meet. So thanks again for joining. I'm really happy to be here.
Happy to be here as well.
Yeah. Yes, and we have our MSU colors showing. We didn't plan it. We did not.
No, we did not. I was like, I would like to wear the green lipstick today, so I picked some other green colors, and all sort of worked out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, it's destiny, honestly. Going back to our roots here.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, now that you've become a doctor, I know that PhDs actually have to do a dissertation, correct?
Yep.
And we were just chatting a little bit earlier about your work with trans students. And this work involves researching about their lives on a personal level, academic level, mental level. And this is something that you have done in student administration on a professional one-on-one basis, and even on a campus-wide effort to be able to distinguish what are the disparities between trans individuals, LGBTQ folks, and those of the general population at college specifically, right?
Yes.
So why don't you discuss a little bit about what drew you to academia? What drew you to student administration and the research that you're doing today?
Yeah, I sort of have the classic educator story that every grade I went up, I was like, I'm going to teach this grade. My sister can regale you with stories of times where like when people would play a bunch of like fantasy things or whatnot growing up, like I always played, one of the things I often played was teacher. And so, when you have younger siblings, they have to be submissive to your imaginative fantasies. And so, I got to college and, I was never really the smart kid growing up. I did well enough like to pass by, but like I was never like in like the smartest bracket of schools. Like when people talk about tracking in schools, I actually knew like what the concept of tracking was very clearly as a kid growing up, because I saw how I was placed in certain classes, not with certain other peers. I never was really good at standardized tests either. And in 5th grade, I got a perfect score on our state's math standardized test. It actually moved me into the highest like math class. So when I started 6th grade, which was middle school in Florida, this group of students had already all been together in elementary school in a way that I hadn't been, and like I was not one of them, right? So like I was like, oh, send me back to the folks I really like get along with in those math classes. Why do I need to be in this one? Anyway, that's a tangent, but it speaks to sort of like my socialization around like eliteness and privilege and these kinds of things. And I got to college. I went to Florida Atlantic University, and I went to their honors campus, which is in Jupiter, Florida, which is about 30 minutes north of the main campus. And there, um, again, like I went to an honors college, and yet like was not even close to like the smartest person around. I was the involved kid. I was like the person who like dazzled people with what I could do, not how I thought. Um, but I really enjoyed thinking, and I really enjoyed uh, um, puzzling through questions of sociology, women's studies, these other things.
Mm,
But what was my really like my chief love, and still is in many ways, was the law. And we actually, I don't even think this came up in our pre-podcast conversation, but my dissertation was actually about how do we think about moving beyond a framework of tolerance in law to a framework of dignity in law,
mm,
specifically at that time around the Civil Rights Act of 1964, potentially an amendment to it
mm,
that would include LGBT individuals.
right,
And that was back in 2012, and that was like 3 or 4 years before we got to some of those cases at the Supreme Court.
right.
So really been thinking through the intersection of sort of gender, sexuality, spirituality for a while. And I always love to teach people. It's always my passion. It's always been my passion. And I think I'm able to connect with people on a human level to help them feel comfortable to learn something new that may be hard to learn at
Mm,
times. Um, and so that's been my calling ever since. I came to do a PhD because I had questions I didn't have answers to anymore. And that's
right.
a good mentor told me, when you go do another degree, when you have questions that no one's answering for you yet. So that's what I did. And now I'm at the other side of that currently.
I like that. I like that. I love how they phrase that because
Yeah.
there's so much to this topic of how civil rights, along with LGBTQ issues, in our ever evolving culture, is supposed to grapple with these issues alongside of those who are progressive, conservative, and what does it mean to be a political identity nowadays? Like
Hmm.
there's so much shifting that has gone on since like the
Hmm.
2016 elections, and
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to understand where we kind of stand. Even as an LGBTQ person, I'm sure you find that there are differing views within your own community, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah. I would love to get into that, but how about you would do the honors of describing your upbringing, your experience? Was it ever religious? Were you surrounded by conservative, liberal folks? How did you come out? What was your experience with your sexuality and your gender identity? And if I could have you actually explain, how you identify now, that would be helpful for the audience too.
Yeah, totally. So I was raised loosely Catholic, I would argue. My dad was never really a religious person. His Neither was his brother, but his sister very much is. But my mom was raised Catholic, and my mom's parents. My grandfather, who I never met, he passed before I was born, was Jamaican, and my
Wow.
grandmother was Chilean and West Indian. Her parents were both. So, um, my uh, when my great grandparents brought my grandmother and my great uncle to the U.S., they were actually separated for decades because their parents were sent back, but the children got to stay.
Mm,
And my grandmother was raised essentially by Dominican nuns,
mm,
so like religiosity sort of was a very strong focus for my mom growing up. Not much less for my dad, and so we attended services off and on, but my mom's big commitment was that both of us did communion in the
mm,
Catholic Church. My sister went further and did confirmation. I did not. It was never really like a. I don't think it was ever like a hard and fast conversation, but it was more like I had other interests I wanted to pursue
right.
than going to CCD, and so did that. Um, but I would attend services sometimes with my mom and sister after that, but it was really off and on. I had a sense that I knew that I was, at the time, gay
Yeah.
really early on in my childhood. Like I sort of always knew it, but I didn't verbalize it to.
Right.
If you want to consider what a coming out is, often people quantify that as like parents. That for me was junior year of college, right? Like 10 days before.
Wow.
And uh, I did it very intentionally so I could like move in early if things went south, all these other things. It didn't go south, but
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
been different. My parents don't necessarily they didn't have religious objections. They had much more. My parents grew up in the time of the AIDS pandemic, or the epidemic rather,
Mm.
and both had lost people to HIV and AIDS, and so it was much more of a medical concern for me
Right.
than anything else.
Right.
Um, Currently, I identify as both queer in terms of my sexuality and queer in terms of my gender, and that is because, like, for me, there's no like there's I don't want my attraction to be fit into some kind of like neatly boxed label, right?
Mm.
Like
Mm.
I am for sure attracted to people who present masculine or present as men, but like I've often also been attracted to folks who present as women. I also am attracted to folks who present as neither of those things, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, um, and then for me, like as like you'll see if you're watching the video version of this, like right, I have facial
Yeah.
hair, like I but I have my nails done. I wear makeup at times, and so I really sort of blur um, this sort of definitive boundary of yes, I'm a man, yes, I'm a woman, right? Like my
Right.
body shape is not necessarily conformist to what we think of as a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, and so like
Totally.
um, that is sort of the blend of all these things for me.
Mm. Yeah, and I like how we're able to discuss about these issues apart from our current social context because I think about gender lines a lot. And I think most people are kind of questioning what are those gender lines today? Talk about Michel Foucault and all these other, critical theorists of that day. And they're talking about how, well, what is sexuality? Is it just these attractions or is there an identity that is also part of the experience, the religious experience, the psychological experience, right? The pathologization of sexual identities
Hmm.
of that time. And you have people in the 17th century, like men wearing wigs and
Hmm.
makeup as well. And that was considered totally normal, right?
Yeah.
But during our time, people take for granted that some of these things that we do, I mean, I come from China. Men wore what would be considered today dresses in the Western context,
Hmm.
So dress styles, hairstyles, all these things change. Now, the question I think for a lot of maybe conservative leaning people, conservatism changes as well. But what are the tenets of American conservatism? That's not really, I think, as pertinent. I think conservatism in the context of sex and gender, what does that mean? And I think the very traditional sense of sex and gender is they're very much overlapping, if not the same thing to a lot of
Hmm.
people. I think that probably a decade ago, we would talk and use those terms synonymously with one another,
Hmm.
right? But now we're coming to understand that, in at least academically, there are certain gender stereotypes, gender behaviors, dress styles, names, right?
Hmm.
That we use more of the exterior stuff, as well as the sexual identity as in terms of the bodily identity, right? So
Hmm.
sex and sexuality. Like if you have a penis or a vagina,
Hmm.
those things they have certain parallels, relationships with one another. Because if you
Hmm.
identify as a man, if you identify as a gay man, well, then it tells us about you in terms of your gender and your sexuality on some level.
Hmm.
So you did a TED talk, I remember, and you talked about constellational thinking or
Hmm.
intersectionality. Is that correct? Could you
Yeah,
explain that?
constellational thinking for sure. Yeah.
Constellational thinking. Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
It's how we constellational thinking is this idea. Um, if you think of the stars in the sky, right, we've created sort of certain images out of them, just paint a bigger picture of meaning for us,
Mm,
right? And part of constellational thinking is thinking how issues interconnect with one another. And so we can understand how, for instance, climate change, depending on what you believe the rate of climate change is, whether it's natural or whether it's man made, whatever it is, right?
right, right, right.
We know scientifically sea levels have risen in the past 50 years more than they have in previous um, centuries, right? So regardless of what you believe the belief of climate change is, what it does is it forces certain island nations to not be habitable anymore, right? That is going to change global migration patterns, right? So we can't think of migration solely as this sort of standalone act that happens, right? But we have to think about how changing climate conditions actually force global migration, right? And then when we think about issues of migration, we can think about issues of what it means to actually be a sovereign nation or not, right? To what extent have the borders folks have created over the years um, reinforced the false idea of how the globe is actually split up, right? So, like, it's this idea. Well, constellational thinking is sort of just making these connections to see how these issues are interconnected with one another and cannot be sort of separated at all, right? I think, I'm trying to think of a good example for this particular audience, but I think that, right, I think the, oh, I'll come back if I can think of a good example,
Yeah.
but like that's the sort of essence of constellational thinking.
Right. Does that tie in with your research then? Like, I mean, for the topic that we're discussing here in terms of sex and sexuality, gender, and trans issues,
Yeah.
how does that play? Do you look into that within your dissertation?
Yeah, so I use historical, sociological, and psychological approaches in my work. And one of the things sociology affords me is the ability to see the connections between someone's sense of self and how that affects their ability to sort of navigate the world. And so one of research that will be forthcoming eventually, it's written, it's just got to be published somewhere, is that let's think about the idea of paying for college, right? How we, whether you are on the side of like there should be some degree of free college, whether that's every institution, whether that's 2 years of community college, whatever that is for you, to the no, everyone pays on their own for college, wherever you are on that spectrum. What I what I know to be true is your placement on that spectrum is what you believe the reason for college is. Right? If you believe colleges and universities are contributing research to a greater public good beyond individuals, you're probably more closer to this free college side, right? Or if you think college solely as a credential for private gain, where like no one else sort of benefits from, my attendance or your attendance at a college, right? You're probably much more on the side of people should pay on their own, right? What I find in my work is that even folks who want to pay on their own, that their gender identity in some ways actually prevents them from getting the help they need to pay for it on their own, right? If without sort of employment protections for trans students who don't want free college, right? I have a few students in the study who like are like, no, I should pay my own way through this. But if they can't hold steady employment because of people discriminating against them, how can they do that? Right? They get locked in this place of, well, you're just not doing it the right way, right? You can think of how for students, for if you ever have you ever filled out the FAFSA?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that there's a question on the FAFSA if you click male that you have to sign up for selective service. Well, if you're trans, what do you click at the beginning if it asks for your sex? You might go with the sex you were assigned at birth. You might think of it as a gender option. So then you get down to the selective service question. That's clearly a gendered question, even though we've sexed it. And now your financial aid is held up potentially from the federal government, and you can't go to college. Right? Like that's how all of this sort of like gender and sex are so ingrained in our institutions that people think like it's just about a checkbox option, where it's actually like that checkbox option then either includes or precludes you from opportunity.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great illustration. Now, do you have people, obviously, in your research that you do research with those students, not only the professors or the researchers themselves, but the students that you're researching? do you have any stories? You don't have to give any specific names if you don't want to, but even if there's people in academia that you helped along the years, could you bring up a story or two about how that looks like? Like what kind of discrimination in terms of job or academics have they faced usually?
Yeah, I think so I study college, right? I really believe in the transformative power of education, and I know a lot of people are coming for a credential, right? So like I want to get them that credential and help them practice reflection on what it means to be a good citizen in the world, right? And um, for a few folks, for trans folks in particular, and for queer folks too, right? College is a time where like no one is from college,
Mm,
right? College is a third space. It's not a space that you, John, are from or I am from. It is a space that we come together and sort of cohabitate and make the rules together of how we do that together, right?
right.
And um, for for many folks, that means exploring new faiths or spiritualities. That means exploring sexual desires that may have been impossible to explore before. That may mean trying on new gender presentations. You know, for some of the students in the study, you know, there's I've followed these students for now 34 months. They've allowed me to, and some of them have lost campus or off-campus employment opportunities because of um, their gender presentation, right? So I think of one example in particular is a student who, um, pre-COVID, of course, was working at a big box retailer near their parents' home because that's where they lived during the summer, right? And for the first 2 weeks, their school is 3 hours away from them. Um, and they liked this job a lot, came with good benefits. They had really good relationships with their supervisor and employees. It was all great. They requested a transfer to the same retailer close to school. It
Mm,
would cut their commute, like, because they were commuting the first 2 weeks both ways. They were commuting 4 hours a day to this job in the first 2 weeks. But they were hoping that a transfer would be approved. So a transfer got approved. The folks in this new retailer, despite no changes in appearance, no changes in job performance, nothing. This student was told they were not allowed to go by their chosen name, right? That they needed to make sure to use the right restroom, right? Even though all the like they were single user gendered restrooms, right? So it's not like
okay.
you're even in there with somebody else.
Yeah.
All these things, and that student, like the student, couldn't take it anymore. Like they made it, I think, 3 weeks and had to quit the job. It was just like a pain to go to, and then they couldn't fathom going back to a 4 hour commute as a student, as a
Yeah.
full time student. It just didn't work that way, and so um,
Right. Fun.
there are some really like if we want the narrative of the if you want over here the very like you pay for college, you work your way through. That's great. I could be down for that. I could be down for a massive expansion of the federal work study program, which has been sorely underlooked at as an option to pay
Mm,
for college. But if we don't hold certain other conditions to allow this reality to exist,
right.
it's really hard to sort of say that everyone's got an equal shot.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think there are going to be people who are, I don't know if we want to label privileged or oppressed here, because I think there's a lot of sensitivity to that type of language. Like, how can we conceptualize Alex or John or whoever within these boxes? A lot of times in academia, DEI training, diversity,
Mm-hmm.
inclusivity training, equity training, we talk about privilege, we talk about oppression. There are certain protected classes of individuals, women, minorities, whether trans or people of color, who have historically been marginalized. They don't have the same opportunities because they don't look or they don't act or present in the same traditional sense as
Mm-hmm.
most men and women and non-gendered people, perhaps. I,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if non-gendered people would be then, the traditional uh, exemplars of privileged, because they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have then male and female individuals as, the stereotypical most privileged individuals within our society and even at college institutions, how do you find your policies or even government policies that you've been researching, that you've been pushing forward or promoting, have been able to do that? We did bring up the research that you've been doing, and there's certain type of equity policies that come into play there, such as the Equality Act, which
Mhm.
we briefly discussed at the beginning of the the discussion that we started prior to
Mhm.
this interview. And do you believe that this type of policy, the Equality Act, will be able to give both those who are the majority, men, women who just
Mhm.
identify with their birth sex, right,
Mhm.
without coming off in such a way where they feel uncomfortable, with having someone who may
Mhm.
identify as trans in their dorm space or in the bathroom or in the locker room, right?
Mhm.
Because those are very muddy waters right
Yeah, I think I hear you. I do.
now.
And I think we just train people to think these ways about being muddy, right? Like, I think of I'm from a really big family. We do a reunion every year,
Okay.
and there are now my cousins now between them all have my dad's side 4 kids.
Mm,
JD, the youngest is or the oldest is 10. The youngest I believe is now 6,
mm,
and no problem getting naked in front of each other. No problem being like some of this is socialized into kids, right? Of like you can't mix da 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 for whatever reason, which is a lot of adult space tiers for kids. Um, I do think to your point about policy,
mm,
do I think that there are ways to protect um, groups' rights and individuals' rights? Yeah, that's the whole story of America is the battle between individual liberty and sort of collective
mm, mm,
good, right?
mm.
I also, so like, you know, I don't know the full details of the Equality Act. I know the generalities. And what I would say to the folks who may oppose it and sort of say it might stifle religious liberty or, because it is, folks are concerned about that to a certain
Right,
extent.
right. Yeah.
Tell me then what the alternative is. because I get because I think what I get challenged by is that it always feels like it's on the folks who are oppressed to figure out how to satisfy the folks who are already being served by the
Sure.
system
Yeah.
to maintain their like part of it is if you take the protests around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders last year, right? Part of white folks confronting their whiteness is that we do have something to lose, right? Like there is something to be lost in these conversations. And so I guess then what is an acceptable loss to the folks who have everything? I can't tell you that, right? Like I've studied it for years and I don't know any major legislation that has moved forward that has come from um, another viewpoint on this that has sought to protect the rights. So that's what I guess like
Right.
part of it is where I try and meet my friends in the middle who
Yeah.
may be opposed to things like the Equality Act or other measures like that. And I said, okay, then you and me, right now, I care about you, you care about me. Tell me what I'm supposed to do.
Mm,
Like tell me how your side is going to present something to me,
sure. Yeah.
right?
Right.
And some folks will see that as sort of like sidestepping the issue, and I'm like, no, because I'm trying to put something forward.
Right. No. Yeah.
And
You want to hear
if
the
you're
person out. Yeah.
if you're saying no to that, tell me what you've got.
Mm.
And if you've got nothing, then well then yeah, of course I'm gonna go with something that's gonna help me out a little bit more
Of course,
until
like
you
every
present something different, right? Like
yeah, yeah. Like every individual, right?
right. There are ways to preserve I do think there are ways to preserve religious liberty and
Hmm.
promote the rights of queer and trans Americans at the same time. And that there are queer and trans Americans who want their religious liberties preserved too.
Totally.
right? And so, um, how, like, is it ultimately about religious liberty being preserved or my religion winning? Is always my question back.
Mm.
Do you mean everybody's religious liberty, or do you just mean yours?
Right. Right.
Those are two very different battles to be had.
I think that's very valid. So, giving us more context, then there are certain issues that the Equality Act and those, say, like the Heritage Foundation and more conservative circles, researchers are doing, and they're breaking down the Equality Act, and they're talking about how federal funding would go towards certain things that they may not believe in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And such as colleges or schools allowing open access to locker rooms and bathrooms for those who are trans and don't identify with their birth sex.
Mm-hmm.
And those, again, I hope that they are rare, but some women may be very traumatized, maybe from a sexual assault, and to be able to see male anatomy within that space could be also doubly troubling, right? So we have this like
Mm-hmm.
duplicity and paradox within our culture right now, the Me Too movement, and then we have how sex is kind of proliferated into this arena where we're able to accept any gendered body, typically. Hopefully we can
Mm-hmm.
have more equal access, right? That's how the argument goes. And if
Mm-hmm.
the Equality Act is promoting that, which it is, like we don't want discrimination of trans individuals, those who sexually identify as homosexual, trans, or
Mm-hmm.
otherwise. We need to be able to give them those same opportunities. And one of my friends, Karin Virtue, actually, who's a trans individual who works for nonprofits and used to be a pastor, they believe that single-use bathrooms are great. Like they're great options.
Mm-hmm.
Like not only are they more comfortable, I don't like to pee next to some guy
Mm-hmm.
or gal over here,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to be in that space where you have more privacy, maybe even more nonviolent, right, for
Mm-hmm.
trans individuals. So if we want protection, but then sameness or equality, I feel like sometimes there is confliction there, such as transgendered athletes in sports, because a lot of girls are being displaced. And that's the case over in Connecticut when 3 girls stepped up and said, I trained all of my adolescent life for this and I could get a scholarship. But because these male trans women or trans girls are taking over, right? They're knocking out 15 girl titles, right, within a couple meets. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what makes it a little bit unsettling. Does it protect women? Does it protect girls? Not only in their same sex spaces, but also in competitive arenas like sports, which has always been very binary because we know that there are
Mm-hmm.
physiological and biological differences between men and women, right? By and large, most men and women, right, are like that. So how do you think
Are men
those
inherently stronger than women?
what's that?
Are men inherently stronger than women?
Average wise, yes. Yeah. So I think now do I want to go against what is that, Gina girl, who was on The Mandalorian? No, she's a pro MMA boxer. No, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But on an average level, men actually have more testosterone, and that helps with development. Even
Mm-hmm.
trans girls who take estrogen for 2 years still have the muscle and the bone build that, and height is a huge, huge factor as well that
Mm-hmm.
gives them success over biological girls.
Yeah. So I don't know the specific Connecticut example you're using.
Hmm.
It's always interesting to me that folks bring up trans women in these debates and never trans men, right? So like part of it is actually we don't. It's sort of a continuation in some ways of misogyny to me that we sort of only care about men invading women's sports. Like that's the trope that's used,
Mm,
but we never ever care about the reverse, right? It's and really
sure.
there are less than I think 20 solid examples of this in the country, and yet 44 bills in state houses this year about it, right? And so, like, to me, we can have a sort of a nuanced debate about this, but the overwhelming evidence just doesn't point that way, right? It's all sort of these anecdotes, and I, as a social scientist, look for bigger patterns, right? So again, I don't know the particular story of Connecticut. I've seen a lot of websites use the same images of people over and over again, that are never competing in particular sports that have like robbed folks of money or livelihood. Number one. Two, do normal people compete as athletes, right? So you use this example of like the norm of a sexed body, right? Is that the person who's competing as an athlete and training as an athlete? No, right? Like women or men who are athletes are going above and beyond to train their bodies and hone their bodies in a different way. So I think the norm example actually undercuts the argument a lot because that's not who's playing sports, right? It's folks who are honing their bodies in different ways. And so um, I think we can like if you want to take sort of like a bodily approach argument to this, um, then shouldn't we like make sure that only people of the same body type are playing certain sports?
So how far? The question is, how far do we want to go
Yeah,
with
I
this?
mean, like
Right.
I think it's actually in some ways not actually about bodies. I just think it's about whose bodies they are,
Hmm.
right? And sort of like this idea of inherent unfairness, um, to like and often it's like youth sports. It's not even often like has the NFL dealt with this? No, right? Like it's like a little league. It's like a not even a little league. It's like a high school soccer game we're talking about. That I'm like, okay, and this does what?
Yeah, I think so. This is the problem, right? I think when we're focusing on those who are marginalized, and I don't ever be trying to be misogynistic, of course.
No, I
I bring
no, of
up
course not.
right, right. But I think what you bring up is valid. Like we shouldn't just focus on trans women in women's sports, right? We should focus on all of them. That's totally fair. But what we want to focus on is protection for women if they are more marginalized and girls, right, in our society.
And we mean cisgender ones, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So those cisgendered women, so biological women and girls. And because we've had so much talk about Me Too, feminism, if that's the narrative there in that area, that respect, and then we're talking about trans issues and how trans women, trans girls are joining in these women's or girl spaces, it does step on their toes a bit, right? If these girls are training all 4 years and even before that in these spaces, say gymnastics, swimming, or otherwise, right? Where height does play a part, track, running. That was the case actually in Connecticut. Three girls stepped up, and that that's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, yes, maybe these are more rare or marginal. I hope so. Like I say that, I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it to say? Are their stories not important? Right? Are their experiences not important? Is their scholarship not important enough to talk about, debate about this? Right? And
Mm-hmm.
the long term effects of this, because we want to keep a close eye on what's going on right now, so that we can have policies that are informed and that will
Mm-hmm.
benefit most people. It can't satisfy everyone. Our policies will never satisfy everyone. That's why we debate and talk about these things. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I mean, we can use the argument saying like their experiences. Well, that's misogynistic, or that's not able to. I know you never have animus when you're saying that, but
Mm-hmm.
it kind of does pit one group over the others. Like, who's more important? You know, who's more oppressed? And how are we supposed to? Because we're always focused on ourselves, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
how do we validate their experiences as girls competing with trans girls, right, in those spaces? How have you been able to do that, especially when you kind of have to focus in on your identity as non-gendered, queer, right, and someone who is white or predominantly white, I assume. And
Mm-hmm.
so, how are you supposed to navigate that when you're checking, your boxes for privilege or oppression? And I think just the nebulousness sometimes that comes alongside of that, because we don't, even though we categorize people, it's so hard to get to know someone simply based on those preconceived notions, of group identity. And a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
times that's harmful. We've seen in sociological studies, psychological studies, how we think about people in terms of their group identity, and that just
Mm-hmm.
adds more stress. I actually have an experience back at MSU. where I worked in a student leadership program, and one of the student leadership aides, so they're essentially helping us student leaders help facilitate, inclusivity, diversity, and just any minority students and international students who may have a harder time coming onto campus. They're a black woman,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a residential assistant, an RA, who was there in the cafeteria, and she was invited to go over and sit with them. And she said, "No." And one of the other student leaders said, "Why?" She said, "Because he's white." And
Mm-hmm.
so I just had a very confusing time, I suppose, within that program, because we talk about inclusivity, talk about allowing others to be who they are, and that means being black, being trans, being all these other identities.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, I didn't see as much of that unity that I was hoping for in some sense, because again, we do have to break down these constructs, these stereotypes, but then we kind of reinforce in a way our identity as black, as queer, as trans, or straight, and that kind of puts actually added pressure against us. Have you seen that? How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think everyone's got their individual stuff to deal with, right? And so, we were reading Beverly Daniel Tatum's "Why Are All the Black Kids Singing Together in the Cafeteria?" Sort of classic psychological text. Talks a lot about racial identity, and one of the points that it makes in the book is you probably picked up this book because of the provocative title. What if the book's title was "Why Are All the White Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" Right? It's because we don't really notice it, right? We don't sort of um, so we sort of gloss over it. And so I think like there are folks who've experienced real harm from others, right? So to sort of like loop back to a point you made earlier, right? So like there may be folks who have trauma related to sexual violence against men that they perceive trans women as somehow men in locker rooms. So like there's a distance they may want from men, right? There's a distance this person in your story could have had that they wanted from white folks, right? Like it's when those biases and those perspectives are codified is when I always have an issue, right? Like part of individual liberty is folks do get to sort of choose who they associate with if they're not, right?
Really? Yeah.
And at the same time, right, I want that perspective to be rooted in a continuous reality, not just one, right? So there are times where there's a time that I was like pretty harshly accosted in a bar when I was going to the University of Georgia. It's a bunch of straight dudes calling me every name you could ever imagine, right?
Yeah.
I didn't feel safe in spaces that I perceived to be predominantly male and straight for a little while, right?
Yeah.
But what was really important for me is I didn't let that continue to be the reality, right? I like tried it out with others, and if that continued again, I would be like, okay, still going to go in this protectionist narrative. So sometimes folks just need space and time to heal and process, right? Like I'm all for crossing difference to build community, and sometimes we have to stay within our same groups to sort of like get what we need energy wise to then go out and do the hard work, right? Because oftentimes, I really interestingly going through, I grew up in South Florida, and so going from elementary school to high school, I never was actually really in predominantly white spaces. Like whiteness was never the norm, nor was black and white the only two races that sort of existed in my worldview, right? Just because of sort of the area of the country that I lived in. And I remember going to Georgia, and there was this thing that was nagging me for 3 months when I was in Georgia, and I was like, what is it? And I landed back and forth, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've just been around a lot of white people, which is not the norm for me. Like, I'm not used to having either majority white friends or attending a majority white institution. Georgia was actually the first one I ever attended that was a majority white institution. And so, which is a very different experience than a lot of white folks that I know, and a lot of like folks of color that I know, right? And so, all this to say that it was a lesson for me to realize, like, this idea of a multiracial America, or a multiracial whatever, or cross-racial whatever,
Right.
required time, healing, and honesty from folks, right? Like, I never take it personally when I have some friends who will say, like, I just need to be around X group today. Okay, that's not about me. That's like something you're naming and need, and I'm going to honor that. And I know you're going to come back around, right? And so I think it's part of like understanding what drives that for people, and not letting them just like rest in it the whole time. But it's also saying, you may just need this time, right? Like, I think there were some white folks after last summer who were just like, oh, I feel so nervous being around people of color right now. I just need to be like with white facilitators who can talk to me about this stuff. Right. And so, like, okay, as long as you're talking to somebody, great. Right. I'm all for it. But if like it's about stagnation, a permanent stagnation, no. Like, that's the real danger to me.
Yeah.
Than it is a momentary stagnation. So I think some folks sometimes just proceed into groups that they feel comfortable and safe in. There are times where when I lived in Michigan, I would plan to go to the gym with other queer people at the time, right? Because I didn't like it's easier to be stared at when a bunch of you are being stared at,
Totally.
right, than just one of you. And so there's some definite benefits still sort of in group time, but like, should all your time be in group? No.
I'm thinking about the experiences of trans queer individuals, especially those who are in high school, in college, where maybe they don't have the day-to-day life where they're going to their job, they have their families to come back to, or whatever their communities consist of. I do see these experiences where Lisa Littman, who's over at Brown University, and Ethel Schreier, they're concerned about especially young girls in high school and college who are transitioning at a rapid rate. It's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And so with rapid onset gender dysphoria, it hasn't been proven to be something that is similar to the experiences of boys, biological boys, natal boys, transitioning later on to become women or girls. The typical type of gender dysphoria that we've seen in its long, 100-year history of gender dysphoria. So with these girls, though, a lot of the times, and just queer, gay boys as well, in high school and college spaces, they do group together, and there's power in numbers, right? There's affirmation, there's connection, and you get to understand yourself a little bit better when you have people that share similar experiences and how they deal with that, how they cope with that, how they navigate those spaces where they're the minority. They feel marginalized in that space. Now, what happens is there's a lot of that talk, like group against group verbal violence in some sense, like hatred in some sense, where queer individuals are talking down cis people. And in Lisa Littman's work, these kids, especially in high school and even in college, their parents are reporting that, they're being called like, oh, you're just a cisgendered woman. What do you understand? And then, for the race topic that we have as well on the side, we see more of that in some sense. Like, even at my church, my church is very diverse. It's called New Community over in Chicago, Illinois. Shout out all my Newcom folks. Hey, there are people who are Hispanic in our church. There's Asian, and there's Black, and there's white individuals. Actually, it's kind of almost like 25-25 each, percent of each. Is kind of fun. So we have a mix of individuals. We worship together, and even some gay couples come to our church as well, right? So it's a very inclusive space. But then just the other week, we have someone who came in as an Asian American pastor, and they were sharing about how they had a rough time with some of the black neighbors who screamed at them, who, vandalized or did awful things. And some
Mhm.
of the black church attendees felt kind of attacked in a way. And so when I'm connecting all my experiences from college to this point now, and also the research that I'm doing in one of the gender laboratories, actually sexuality and gender dysphoria laboratories that I work at, it just seems like these experiences are partly rooted in the fact that we're emphasizing race and gender and sexuality so much to the point where there is this discordance, right, happening where we feel like it's us against them. So I
Mhm.
think what you're saying there is very helpful because we get to pause. Okay, that could just be an incident on its own, and not to see that individual and what they said to me, what they did to me, what they screamed at me as inclusive of everybody who identifies as such, whether they're black, whether they're Hispanic, whether they're Asian or Christian or LGBTQ.
Mhm.
How how do you see on a greater level, whether it's in academia, the research that you're doing, or on a policy level, or beyond the personal level that you just kind of brought up, like we have to do this mental judo
Mhm.
moves, right? We have to like remember, wait, not everybody's like that. How do we go beyond that in terms of, things like the Equality Act, but also in academic settings as a leader yourself, as a student administrator and someone who's had so much experience doing this, leading students to have better discussions? What kind of examples, what kind of things should we be doing on the higher up level?
Mm. One, I think that part of the various examples you brought up, I think there's some nuance there I want to just tease apart really quick that I think
Yeah, please.
relates to the sort of bigger piece.
Yeah,
So one is I think was oh gosh, like the folks sort of like, oh, you're this, so thus you don't understand, right?
mm,
One of that is like what we see in research about both marginalization and privilege is that sometimes folks who hold marginalized identities are trying to protect their energy, right? They're like, you don't understand, so I'm going to create a very simple justification why you don't understand, which is based on something you are. And thus, because I know other people who are like you are this, you
right,
must
right,
also
right.
be this. It's a common sort of schema we build up
Yeah,
in psychology, right?
right, totally.
That has just now got a new linguistic twist to
Mm,
it. And so part of that is like, are you doing this in this moment to protect your energy, or are you just choosing not to engage complexly? Right? I'm all for people protecting their time and energy, right? But if our goal and our efforts are to cross difference and build community, then there are times that we have to take risks, and everyone's got to take those risks, right? Sometimes I've said to folks who've been like, well, you're just this, right? And you're not going to get it. Well, that means I got to show up a little bit differently to those folks, right? Um,
totally.
to show that I actually maybe do get it in a different way. Two, I think, is how much of this is what some scholars would call front stage talk, what we sort of present to everybody, and backstage talk of like what we talk about within our groups of people,
Right.
right? So I think the church example is actually really powerful in that um, a potential backstage conversation got put on our front stage, right? Every one of us can be complicit in um, furthering stereotypes of a group, right? And I think what sometimes a lot of people feel like, even my defensiveness about sort of the previous questions about sports, right? Part of that is it because it activates something in me where I'm like, but like that's just not the case for everything, right? But it gets it's presented in a way. I'm not saying this is what you did. I'm saying
Right,
this is what
right.
activates this. It's like um, that I'm like, oh, I need to defend my group immediately,
Of
right?
course.
And so
Yeah.
um, that also comes up, right? Like I think that um, so anyway, so there all that exists.
Yeah.
I think in terms of when I did work at Michigan State with the Intercultural Age, of which you were a part of, when I've done work with other groups, I'm saying, so what's ultimately at stake here, right? It's always my guiding question um, to really sort of recenter the room as like, what's the actual issue here,
Sure.
right? Are we so um, as popular media would like to sort of display, so fractured
Mm.
that who you are automatically disqualifies me from engaging you?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what's at stake? Is there something broader at stake that we can sort of all attach ourselves to, right? And like part of it is, I was reading Ezra Klein's new book, Polarized. It's a really good read if you're interested in political psychology.
Mm.
And a lot of political psychologists and political scientists have sort of come to the same conclusion in the book. It's just like the way it's very sort of like written for the everyday reader, which I really enjoy in this particular book, and talks about how our political identity has sort of just become a big signifier of so many things to all of us. Which, if I can hold on to the idea that human beings are complex and can change,
Mm.
cannot fundamentally be true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Right? There are some things that the political party I am more likely to vote for, but I've been a lifelong independent. That there's some things they do, I'm like, what are we doing, folks? Like, really? This? Not it, right? Then I can see some of the appeal, either in another group or the opposite group, though I think there are multiple groups.
Yeah. Is there an example?
Gosh.
Yeah. Maybe less. Yeah.
I actually, I don't know if people are gonna like this when it comes out, but I don't know if I love hate crime laws. And it's a big push from Democrats often to publish hate crime laws.
Right.
Part of it is actually reinforces a criminal punishment system I think is not going to use that law in the best way possible, right? And actually punish more people who may not actually be perpetrators of such an offense than there might be, right? And so I actually don't know if I fundamentally agree with codifying this idea of hate crimes laws, not because I don't agree there aren't hate crimes,
right.
But that it gives more power to an administrative state that I'm very skeptical of.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. So I can actually get on board with a lot of people who maybe oppose that legislation. I just maybe oppose it for a different reason.
Totally.
Right. So I think that there are ways to explore these complexities, and part of my job, was I always needed to model that for students. Like I needed to show that I was willing to have the tough conversations and be really imperfect at it, right? And that's okay because you're gonna screw up.
Right.
I think that everyone thinks. I think everyone is I think a lot of people are under an assumption that folks who maybe are on the right side of the political spectrum are dumb, ignorant, don't know any better, racist, all these things.
Yeah.
And that the folks on the left are pompous,
too free loving,
SJWs, perfectionists, whatever, right?
Right.
And if anyone actually had the answer to a true multiracial democracy, I feel like we'd all have agreed upon it by now. Right. And so what I really try and do with my work is I really try and understand, which is a choice I make, right? I don't think everyone has to make this choice. I really research how folks with privilege really think about and try and hold on to it, right? Because it's fear-based oftentimes. Like
it is.
Like I haven't had to navigate the world in this way, right? Like I think that I'm trying to think of a really good example. I think Serena Burke will say this, like the Me Too movement was not a movement about accountability. It was about a movement of sort of validating these experiences happen. But popular discourse says the Me Too movement is about accountability broadly for perpetrators of sexual violence.
Right. And Tara Burke, she's the one that actually started the
founded the hashtag Me Too. I got to meet her once. She's actually really a lovely person.
Yeah.
And men, for the first time, rightfully or wrongfully, felt a lot of fear about being fired for no good reason. And it was like, what a concept. Because in Iowa, in fact, guess what can happen to yours truly right now with just cause.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not like and the thing is, I don't want others to have that fear.
Right.
Right? To like get mine. Yeah. And for some people, that is truly how the needle moves.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so I think, our role as educators is to really help people perspective take as much as possible in a world that really like values you being dug in to your perspective.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with that sentiment. So since you've studied, queer theory, and I know that comes alongside a bit with feminism and Marxist theory as well about power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I hear Marxism, my Chinese roots and history comes out a little bit because I just get a little.
How could you not?
Yeah, exactly. Get a little bit hesitant, Power struggle. Now, of course, those who are impoverished, those who are oppressed, like we all want to be able to bring them out. And fun fact, China was only able to do that for their most marginalized and impoverished people through capitalism. So apart from the economic side of it, the political element is so empowering to trans folks, to gay folks, women, and so forth, because they are the marginalized class. And when we talk about these different narratives of us versus them, there's a psychological study in the 20th century by Sherif and his colleague. Now, they talk about how a camp of boys, they played just fine with one another when they didn't have different teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when they have different teams, they started mocking one another, spitting at each other, hitting them and getting in fights. And then an intervention partway through was to give them an objective, a common enemy, or a cause, some type of issue that was beyond them. And I think COVID could have been something, for a lot of people on the left and right. I don't think that's been the case necessarily, but we haven't seen that type of unity that we both have been trying to ascribe to or promote. And I think there are these underlying topics that are just not discussed enough. People are not willing to talk about it, like how you're willing to talk about it. And I like that you're bringing the nuance, because you don't think like everybody on the progressive left or on the alt-right. And most people don't fall on those polar ends, but usually just takes the top 10% of the left or the top 10% of the right, that not talk about, again, money here, just the very extreme ends, the tail ends, that move the conversation one way because it's hot, because it's really scandalous in some sense, right? So coming back to transness and queerness, first of all, I wonder what queerness means and queer theory, because I did bring on Sharon Chia Claro as our mutual friend and colleague, and she explained queerness as this ever-evolving theory about self-acceptance, about promoting well-being, obviously, for people who are gay, who are trans. And how do you make sense of queer theory? What is it? Because if it's ever evolving, I'm still thinking through this. How do you have a movement that's ever evolving? And, people make fun of this, but the acronym LGBTQ, it's like LGBTQIA+, and sometimes it's ever evolving, like adding on more people and allies as well. So you don't even have to be gay or trans to be LGBTQ. If you're an ally, if you just support the cause. Obviously, we want everybody to get on board with this idea, but what is the idea? What is behind LGBTQ alongside of queer theory for you?
Yeah, so I'll try and make distinctions as best as I can. So queer theory is sort of a branch of a broader philosophical idea of what's called post-structuralism. It's this idea that it's sort of this post-enlightenment. It's a post-enlightenment idea that like there's a rational world and there's sort of a rational understanding of everything that then sort of came the ideas of constructivism and then sort of post-structuralism. And queer theory, the best metaphor I've heard, I can't remember the source, and if I can remember, I'll make sure that you can attribute it in the show notes, is that queer theory is like mercury in a thermometer. It reacts to its surroundings, and that changes how it understands the environment. So it's a tool to sort of understand how like heterosexual norms are ingrained in society. It really rejects this idea of in psychological theory, like Erik Erikson is a very predominant psychosocial theorist in psychology, or what really sort of the founder of sort of psychosocial identity theories in psychology. Right. And Erikson says you go through 8 like sort of life stages, right? Queer theory is like, no, we're just always changing. Like we are actually, there's no such thing as a stable sense of self. Mm-hmm. That is a sort of falsehood we've been given, right? And that's both a very freeing idea and a very terrifying idea for a lot of people, right? And so, queer theory to me is a way I sort of sometimes use in my research to really help explain. Queer theory points out who's allowed certain definitions and who is not, right? Just as the idea of heterosexuality is really sort of a more recent century construct than it was. Like heterosexuality doesn't naturally exist in the world as a name, right? Sure. We've given it a name and we've given a lot of meaning of what that name stands for. Right. That's what post-structuralists do. Yeah. Because then we do post-structuralists point out slippages in meaning and how those slippages in meaning sort of form this endless chain of meaning that has a lot of consequences for who's allowed those meanings. So, right, we think of a lion. A lion is it's a leader. A leader is associated with a strong person. A strong person is associated with a man. Right. We have thus attached maleness to being a lion.
Right. Is there any biological or physical reality to any of this? I feel like
no. It's just sort of like how meaning just continues to slip down this endless chain of consequences. Okay. And so, how we take something like heterosexuality to mean normal, to mean healthy. And how that meaning just slips that way, right? Whereas like the lavender scare of the 1950s was about finding homosexuals who were deviant, who were dangerous, who were weird. Slippage of meaning all over again. Yeah. So that's what queer theory does. Queer theory helps us also see like why an acronym is imperfect. Right? Like, that's why we keep adding to the acronym, because folks continue to think about, we don't have sort of this, like, it's sort of why I use the broad umbrella of queer, even though I recognize for a lot of people that is seen as a slur or a harmful term, right? Sure. It's because it's the closest thing I have to not listing out every single identity, which isn't the point of the acronym. It's supposed to just signal a group. Yeah. Right. And so, so that's part of that sort of endless chain of like recognizing that there's just so much possibility out there, right? Like when I worked at the LBGT Research Center at Michigan State, everyone asked us for a terminology list, and we finally sort of caved in and gave it to them. But what we did was we posted like every term we knew of. That was 27 pages on like 10-point font, not double spaced, right? Like, I don't know what all those terms mean, but what I'm open to is knowing what they mean to those people who use them. Right. And that's ultimately, I think, the key, right? Like, people can say things like, I'm a Southerner. And oftentimes they mean, I'm from the South, right? But there's also a Southern culture that they're probably also really attached to that drives that identification. And I want to know what parts of Southern culture drive that identification, right? Is it about growing up and like, because I am from the South, I will say this, is it knowing like what the right kind of sweet tea is versus the wrong kind of sweet tea, right? Uh-huh. Is it knowing that you just call it Coke and it's not soda? Or, when I moved to the Midwest, everyone called it pop and I was like, what the, like, what is this? And so like, it's more for me about like we actually use a bunch of labels all the time that mean like that one people sometimes impose upon us, right? I study identity development, and like
Right.
part of identity development is there are certain identities people impose upon us no matter what.
Mm.
But there are certain identities we actively claim that do have significance to us beyond
Mm.
their textbook definition. And so I think it's actually like, in some ways, LGBTQ folks have sort of paved the way to think about how we make meaning of ourselves
Right.
beyond sort of the simple label of it, right?
Right. Very fascinating. Thinking about it in a historical lens, even for those who are watching that are Christian or conservative, maybe you're uncomfortable with the topic of LGBTQ or gay issues, but this is a very relevant topic because we all kind of come in with a very enlightenment type of posture that there is things in the world, we discover it, we observe it, and that gives us all the information that we need. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a balance, I would say, that we all have to appreciate with solipsism, which is the idea that you also create your reality based on how you think. And that could be from your environment, even biology. I think we all kind of concur that there's biological realities apart from ourselves. And John Boswell, a gay intellectual in the 20th century, also wrote about this. He wasn't a strict constructivist, someone who just believed in words creating everything.
Mm-hmm.
But then, before going deeply into the philosophical issue of what is our reality? Is it physical or is it mental? And I think there's got to be a mixture or a alignment of both. So for those conservatives, if you are a Christian and maybe even Jewish here, what comes to mind is this idea of Israel, right? The nation of Israel, and it came from one man who left his father, and there's generations of people that came after him, 12 tribes
Mm-hmm.
of Israel, right? And his name before was Jacob. So even
Mm-hmm.
God, in the narrative, in that sense, history was made by naming. History was made. People identified with names all throughout history. All throughout history, I was actually named Chen Jun in Chinese because my dad actually made a bet with my mom about my gender. I love
Mm-hmm.
all the constellational thinking here, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the intersections here. But my mom lost, obviously. Well, at least I'm not changing my gender anytime soon. But my father won the bet, and so he said Chen Jun. Jun means
Mm-hmm.
accurate because he guessed accurately. So
Mm-hmm.
there's so much meaning to how we identify because there's experiences, there's shared experiences between us, whether you're a man or a woman. And I think that's what's troubling for me because I want to understand more and more about queer theory, about the LGBTQ community, and as someone who
Mm-hmm.
has come out myself, like how do I reconcile the bits of me that are Christian and also sort of queer, like my
Mm-hmm.
same-sex attractions, and thus I still have my more conservative leanings. I would say more like center right in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
and it's ever growing. But there has
Mm-hmm.
to be some tenet, there has to be some ground that's grounding all of us in reality. And that shared experience is so powerful in doing that. So let me read something from a conservative, Ryan T. Anderson, from his book When Harry Became Sally. And he writes in page 3, activists tend to be uncompromising in their demands, yet their worldview is fraught with contradictions. It holds that the real self is fundamentally separate from the material body, yet insists that transforming the body is crucial for personal wholeness. It attaches a notion of authentic gender identity to stereotypical activities and dispositions, yet it grows from a philosophy holding that gender is an artificial construct. It promotes a radical subjectivity in which individuals should be free to do whatever they wish and to define the truth as they choose, yet it calls for enforced conformity of belief in transgender dogma. Now, I think he may conflate this with some more radical views or, and there are very loud radical views. I don't think this holds to what you believe in necessarily. But how do you make amends with that? Because I think there are a lot of conservative leaning people who feel a bit uncomfortable with this idea. How can you tell us that you identify as X sex, the opposite sex, or non binary, when there are obviously sex indicators? And we can bring up, intersex as part of that conversation when we're talking about sexual biology. But how do we know for sure who has the authority to say that, right? Within queer theory, within LGBTQ issues, where is the authority from that? Is it from biology? Is it the doctors? Is it the sole individual? For me, it seems like it's the sole individual, the person who self-identifies, right? How do you reconcile the artificial construction, the social constructivism, right, that I brought up, the mental construction of reality with the physical things? Because we have medicalization of gender dysphoria, which ensues surgeries and hormone therapy and all that, trying to align the body with their psychology, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's ultimately about folks.
Is there
I
any
guess,
personal
I
experience?
guess, I guess for me, like it always comes down to so there are social differences that make a difference, right? Like race, gender, class. Those are differences we have indeed constructed that are not actually like they're not based in a reality beyond like we've actually sort of justified them through other realities like biological realities, right? Like we think of like eugenics and race in
Yeah.
particular, right? Like and how we
Okay.
sort of justified racial differences that actually never really existed um, biologically, maybe besides phenotype, right? Which is often sort of the indicator of race, but like there's no
Right. Country of origin, where you came from.
right. All these things, these become stand-ins for these things,
Yeah.
and I think that for me, it's so much less about who is like who is the like ultimate say of like who is and who isn't. Like I guess that it's that I know that certain people are going to be treated more differently than others. So, like for instance, Mike Huckabee yesterday tweeted some. I believe he was like, "I now identify as Chinese," right?
Yeah.
And he's playing somewhat to what this author is saying of like this is
Right.
this radical subjectivity that people can sort of just say what they are and we are
Right.
supposed to take them at face value, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Mike Huckabee's Chinese now. Let's take the train. Let's like take the train that he's now put us on.
Right.
Is Mike Huckabee going to be fundamentally treated differently because of his verbal identification? No, he will still be treated as a white man, right? So like part of it is that trans folks are sort of taking a step to say I identify this and like knowing it's going to put them in more physical harm.
Right.
It's not going to put Mike Huckabee in physical harm to say this about himself, right? And then it's about what we do with that information. You know, there are people who go through tons of kinds of body modification that we don't label as wrong or ill. It's just because there are certain parts they want to change that we label it that way, right?
Say a nose job or tattoos.
Right, or like ear extension, like the sort of oh gosh, what is it?
Gauges.
Yes, like gauges, like all these other things. Like we don't consider those
Yeah.
medically wrong, and we don't invest time and energy into studying why they're medically different, right? And so like part of it for me is like so what? So again, what's at stake in this conversation?
Right. Right.
And for some folks, it is like, well, what if they change their mind, right?
Right.
Every trans person I know who's undergone any sort of hormone replacement or surgery has thought about it for years. It's not like they can just go and waltz in and do it, and it's really expensive, right? It's
Right.
not like folks are sort of making these decisions on the fly.
Well,
Um,
I think that contradicts some of the research, like with Lisa Littman, Abigail Schreier, and actually in the UK they started banning hormone therapy because for those who are under 16, because there isn't enough efficacy with those results, and there's even Swedish studies that have shown like long-term effects, suicidality, depression, anxiety, other comorbidities, right, substance abuse, still have not gone down. So I think there is nuance. I don't think that everybody has had a bad experience, but there is a large looming population of people that's harming, right?
sure, in some ways, I I would love to see all this research,
Yeah,
right? Because I would love to be having the same conversation, but like you're bringing in evidence I don't know the veracity of, right? And I trust you and trust that
Right.
you've done the research.
Right.
And like, I think it's always really harmful when folks are like, well, I've read this study and like you haven't. And so here's this perspective I'm going to offer. And I don't, as a social scientist, I take evidence really seriously.
Mm.
Right. And so like,
Of course.
please send me all these links after because I do want to read this. Right. And I want to know better for myself.
Right.
And what I would say is that, you know, I think by and large, the majority of trans folks do not desire biomedical transition in any way.
Mm.
Right? So again, is it about the outlier case that's determining the majority again? Like,
okay.
I think that, you know, even in the case of the sports examples before, it's somehow that the majority got to determine the outlier, not the outlier determining the majority, right? So it's sort of like
Right.
I'm trying to quell my defensiveness right now.
Yeah.
Because I think that to me it's ultimately like, to what degree do people have autonomy over their own bodies and lives? And then what do I do with that autonomy and choice is ultimately what it's about for me. Right? So if folks want to choose to
I think the concern that I was trying to bring up with those studies,
mm-hmm.
obviously I respect people's decisions because they're the expert of their own lives,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can't know what they feel like, but we know that there are people with mental health issues that, again, outside of the trans community, that we want to be able to help alleviate their personal issues. And that doesn't make them an expert in psychology, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
issues that Lisa Littman, Abigail Schreier, and even Ryan T. Anderson are bringing up is there's actually a really high volume of, especially teenage girls, but young adolescents and adults that are going to college and getting cross-sex hormones. And our friend Sharon Chiaglaro is helping implement a system where it's the consent model. So if you have read through the risks, then you're good.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't even need a doctor's note because that would be not discriminating, but it would kind of put them against their own self-described identity because the cross-sex hormones would affirm them in their desire to become whatever gender identity, non-binary or male, female. So that does cross on the lines of medical efficacy, efficacy and ethics of treating individuals. Because if we're allowing the consumer or the client, the patient, to decide fully, what their illness is, or even if they don't have an illness, but they might, then why does this work for people who are gender dysphoric? Like if they can't decide that they don't have gender dysphoria, but then for those trans individuals who may not be gender dysphoric, they can still decide to take those hormones, even though it's not been FDA approved, or the surgeries, again, have not shown long-term successful effects, right? So in those Sweden studies, which it's been very open since like the 70s, right, for people to transition very early on. Do you see the value? Obviously lives and health is at risk of being jeopardized here, because if we're allowing people to just take hormones, which can cause certain types of cancers and also bone density issues, heart issues, fertility, what does that say about our culture? How do we confront this? Because it seems like ideology is really driving the conversation, in my opinion, like affirm.
I think I'm about affirming someone's social sense of self, and that I guess I don't know a single trans person who's ever made these decisions that hasn't read all this research. I guess is my point. Is that like part of the assumption is that folks are like can just go access hormones like this and just inject themselves and haven't thought about it for more than a second, right? And that's I can't actually name a single trans person I know, and I know a lot of them, and I study a
Yeah.
lot of them,
Yeah.
that have ever thought about that. Right? Like I have students in the study who are just starting hormones, maybe in their third year of college, after doing research for 5 years about it.
Mm.
Like it's like the trans students I work with and know policy better than any cisgender person I've ever met. They know medical research better than any cisgender person I've met, because it's about their body, right? Like they have paid attention to these things, and I think often the at least I'm not going to speak to the psychologist whose studies I haven't read, but sort of the commentator in the book that whose quote you read is
Right.
sort of like these are just misguided people who are just like jumping into something and not knowing the consequences. And I'm like, is that true?
Mm.
Um, and again,
Yeah.
I
I think it's just so important because we need to distinguish how many people are being affected by this in a positive way and in a
mhm.
negative way. And
Right, and I don't know if that's what any of these authors have done.
so they're
Right.
trying to bring to light the detransitioners. And I think the thing is, no one has to be a scientist to use this tool, YouTube.
Hmm.
If you go on YouTube and you look at detransitioning, and it's been very popular right now to post your detransitioning story. So
Hmm.
again, not to dismantle the idea that people can't transition because some people may very well need it. And
Sure, there's always been
yeah,
people who've detransitioned though, but I guess they're never actually the numerical majority.
so
Just because
that's
something is trending on TikTok doesn't mean it's the trend, like a sociological fact, right?
so the issue with that I think myself and other people may feel is if we're not talking about detransitioners' experiences, right, really validating them, then people aren't really seeing the reality of the risk. And Blake, one of the examples in Abigail Shire's book, they had a hysterectomy, at college. Like they're young. They had these issues because they were transitioning. So
Hmm.
that is a rare case, but that's still a case, and we should be able to bring those up just so that people know what are the risks involved. Infertility. If you remove your breasts, can you have them back? Can you have kids in the future with the infertility? Of course, like that, there's some complications. You can freeze your eggs or
Sure.
something, but what are those things that we're talking about here, other than just feeling the dissonance sometimes with your body? Because dissonance takes many forms, and we still don't, as researchers, know all the precedents or the catalyst for gender dysphoria to the
Hmm.
T. You know,
I don't think we ever will though.
we may never will, but we should try. And think about
Yeah,
it.
and I guess I don't know who's delegitimizing detransitioners.
Well, actually, there's a girl named Charlie actually over the UK.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and they did identify as male, so it's Charlie, but it's a girl.
Hmm.
Like they detransitioned, so not insinuating that they were like mixing up their pronouns or anything.
No, sure.
Over in the UK, and they were trying to speak up about this, but then the LGBT community they didn't want it. They felt really attacked in some sense, and
Hmm.
it was just their story. And if you go on BBC and listen to their story, I can link it down below. They talk about their experience in detransitioning, and she identifies as a lesbian. Why can't She's saying like, I just
Hmm.
felt like maybe there are some structural issues, maybe with me feeling like I wasn't as privileged enough as a man, and I wanted to assume the male role,
Hmm.
right? Because there's more power maybe ascribed to the male role. So that's another part of the conversation. But she didn't feel like there was room in the LGBT community to talk about it. There's a lot of shame almost with detransitioning. Yeah.
I think there's definitely shame. I think it's shame like any major life decision folks go through. I think I know of some folks who've it's just sort of about the further exploration of self. But again, I don't know anyone who hasn't been not paused by these decisions.
Right.
Like I don't see that. Like I want people to have an affirmative sense of self, and
Yeah.
I guess I feel like folks that I know have always taken these decisions with for those who have desired to biomedically transition in some way,
Mm,
whether that's just hormones or
mm,
I think I mean the U.S. Trans Survey has the most up to date information, but I think less than 10% of trans folks sort of like surgically transition in any way. So I'm fine with talking about a minority of cases. I'm not opposed to that.
Right, and the question is it a minority of cases? Because the rapid
Mhm,
onset gender dysphoria, again, has, like, a rise of 44,000% of young girls, right, going into these gender clinics since, like,
mhm.
the early 2000s. So,
Yeah, I guess part of that though is that can there's several explanations for
right,
that,
are
right?
we diagnosing more, right? That's
Are we Do people have more possibility models than they did before?
exactly.
So for instance, there was this big like hoopla in the news about like more people identifying as gay and bisexual than ever before. And I'm like, yeah, because an entire generation was wiped out by the AIDS crisis. So yeah, we actually don't have population metrics for older generations that match younger generations
Mhm,
because we lost a lot of people. So it's sort of like I'm a social scientist. I want to rigorously investigate significant findings.
totally.
And and sometimes outliers are really significant findings to tell us a different narrative than we're used to, right? I don't want to shy away from that.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
And I think that
Mhm,
so like even in another example of like this idea of whose college debt should be wiped out right now, right?
okay,
And everyone uses this like, well, some of these people have $100,000 in debt. Those folks literally represent 5% of all people who have debt from college, right? And so like people are building a case about 95% of people with 5% of people,
mm,
right? And so I agree. Let's find out how many people it exactly is, but let's also get the cause right. Just because we see an uptick
right, right.
in cases, right?
I think there's
So
issues with proportion too. I think that's a very valid point to make because, well, 5% out of how big of a population and how much money exactly? Tuition's not cheap, right?
right.
And I think that's valid to bring up though for the trans discussion because Abigail Shrier, she's a journalist by trade, and she didn't want to touch this story because she didn't want to be labeled as transphobic or be turn off to some individuals. And she's not like a religious conservative by any means.
Hmm.
She wrote about this and those staggering statistics, right? Like the 4,000% increase, and now 2% of high schoolers are actually identifying as trans on average, right,
Hmm.
in America. So it could be diagnosing and allowed a higher allowance of acceptance, right, for those individuals who want to identify that way. But the question is, why aren't older generations doing that, right? If there is such an acceptance, why is it just the younger folks that are doing this at such a rapid rate? And like we should be able to see people with true genuine gender dysphoria because they're saying gender dysphoria, not just trans, like I think I want to be trans, but gender dysphoria, things that they can't contrive by nature,
Hmm.
contrive, right, consciously bring up. We
Hmm.
should see 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds saying like that was my experience and coming out with their story. But we don't at the rate, right? The
Hmm.
exasperating numbers that we see within the younger populations. Yeah. So the influence that she brings up is the partly because of these individuals being female and also autistic, like not because they're female, but these female are autistic as well, and there's
Hmm.
that symptom of fixation. And these girls, she says, if it's not cutting themselves or anorexia, this very highly sensitive group of individuals would have been involved in some other way of trying to figure out their identity and their struggles. And they're very high achieving too. It's not like
Hmm.
they're just really low peg individuals. No, no, these are really smart girls, but they're highly influenced by this type of narrative right now. And so what I hope to do is like, well, if if it is an allowance of us to accept whatever identity we want to, then why is there not the same type of mindset within the older population? You know, why aren't they doing it the same rate as well? And I think that's something valid to bring up.
Yeah, I think that's valid, and I think that part of it could also be socialization, right? Like I guess there aren't a lot of older people identifying as pansexual because they wouldn't think of it as an option of a sexual identity,
Yeah.
right? And so I think Krista Tippett is right in that words make worlds,
Mm,
and the ability like students that I have talked with and in like trans related research talk about the power of the internet to give them knowledge and terms that they never had before.
Right.
That I like for all intents and purposes, my parents believe me to be gay, right? It's a term that they understand, can attach to. They're never going to get queer. I don't want to bring it up to them for a lot of reasons. And like, it's because that's a term they get is gay.
Right.
Right. And so they would never think of like referring to me as queer. And so I think like I want to investigate the causes too, and maybe, all these pieces, but there is, I think, an element of like not just the bio side of psychology, but the social side of psychology that's really important here. That the idea of having a possibility model is really important to your sense of self, right? Like you, in some ways, need another version of you out there to aspire to,
right?
Than you could have if for folks who were 50, 60, 70. So
right. Yeah. Young people do have that.
Yeah.
Right. And like Caitlyn Jenner and Jazz Jennings, these very huge icons for the community. Like hopefully they're able to do that. But also in the sense like these young girls typically and young individuals more broadly do have that issue. It's like, well, you're going to modify your body and these things are irreversible to a certain degree, right? Especially if you do surgery.
So I think the other piece I would add to this is that one of the things I find in my research, which I think is actually, I've had at least 7 students who stopped hormones for whatever reason who started it when they were in the study. And again, 24 students I've worked with, and I'm a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative researcher. I'm not looking for the big, or this project is qualitative, I should say.
Yeah. Right.
Anyway,
numbers. Yeah.
But part of it is that people become so attached to binary expectations of gender because those are seen as legitimate genders to people. And people see hormones and surgery as legitimizing agents, right? And so a lot of the students in the study have gotten to a sense of self that they've been able to find in college with other trans peers to say, actually, I think I'm much more non-binary or more cross-gender in my presentation. And I don't desire these medical legitimizers anymore. So if people want to take seriously the issue of the studies you're bringing up about like the potential really harmful effects of all this stuff, then I would say let's create environments where people don't think they have to buffer their gender by being sexually legitimate, biologically legitimate, right? Because if that's what we tie gender to, right, then of course people are going to go pursue those options. But if we know that sex and gender are very different concepts, right, but if we continue to make them one concept, then yeah, folks are going to pursue behaviors and options for themselves that make them legitimate in the eyes of others. Because at the end of the day, one of our innate desires as humans is to be seen. And if I want to be seen as a legitimate human, I'm going to satisfy the conditions that make me a legitimate human. And sometimes that's rooted in others' definitions, and so I'm going to pursue those. But as these students in my study moved away from requiring that their gender was determined by other people, they moved away from these aspects of self they didn't need anymore, that they didn't rely on. Some of them still do, by all means. So it's not a sole indicator of identity development, but it loosened the grip these things had to make these folks legitimate. So,
right, I see where you're coming from. Totally. Yeah, I think we are really focused on pathologizing, like Sharon says. Like, well, giving medical aid, there has to be some level of pathologizing, right? So even if it's just hormones, and there's a fair enough amount of trans individuals, even within your own study, right, that are taking hormones. So there has to be some type of medicalization of trans identities in some sense, whether the individuals might not like it. We can discuss about that, right? And I think we have to do a look at an individual by individual basis.
Well, I think the medicalization is what other people see as legitimate, and that's why they go
totally, yeah. So my conundrum here is that people look at the trans community as illegitimate in some sense that their biological reality is not in concordance with the language that we use, because we talk about sex as a biological reality, as you do too,
Mhm.
and in concordance with gender too. So most
Mhm.
people and their language as well as their body ascribe to this reality where both sex and gender are intimately linked in some way.
Mhm.
Maybe not the exact same, right? Sex doesn't indicate the exact behavior or dress style. Look at various cultures, throughout history. Like, no,
Mhm.
but there is an average or some type of commonality, right, between the same sex groups, right? Whether it's male, female, and then you have different genders today, and even Baraka Indians say in other parts of history. What is commonly held within our language, as you say, is very true in how we interpret the world, how we see the world. Super important. And the issue is that if you delegitimize the gender dysphoric individual's experience, not saying that trans individuals who identify as trans and don't transition are delegitimizing that, but it has that effect. If you have trans individuals just saying, I'm trans, I identify as this, as two spirited, or as demisexual or sapiosexual, and all these different identities that we are finding very novel, very new, and maybe exciting or
Mhm.
strange to some individuals, it's kind of hard to relate to. And I think what I hope from this discussion here today is they will be able to relate to you, whether they're conservative, progressive, otherwise. How do we make sense of trans identities? How do we make sense of gender dysphoria? How legitimate is it to them as individuals? And
Mhm.
I'm really grateful for your time, because I know that you're doing incredible work trying to legitimize the experiences of everybody in the LGBT community, whether they agree with you or with me
Mhm.
or anyone else. I thank you so much for your work. Really, it means a lot.
Anytime. Happy to be
Yeah.
here.
I will give you a few more minutes. Do you have anything to say to the world? What do you want to get out there?
Yeah, I really hope that we all fundamentally lean into our desire to belong rather than exclude.
Mm,
I hope that we lean into our proclivities of curiosity before our stances of judgment. And I hope that, like, there are times where I think I got really tense in this conversation
yeah,
and
me
wasn't
too.
my best self, right? And I also think that, like, this is the imperfect work that has to happen,
Right,
right?
right.
Um,
Yeah.
because ultimately, I think we're both concerned about human flourishing, and we come at it from
Mm,
two different angles.
totally.
And I think that there are times that we can see that a person. I think there are times that there are definitely people who do not want others to flourish. I'm not going to
Yeah.
sit here and be like every human being wants everyone else to flourish. It's not true.
Right.
Um, but I think there's enough of us that want a just, caring, and thriving world.
Yeah.
That's just going to be tough to get to.
Mm, very good. Well, Alex Lang, Dr. Lang, thank you.
LOL.
I really appreciate your time.
Anytime.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you again. This is John Chen, Out to the World. I'm John Chen, your host, here with Alex Lang.